The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great stories since 1898. If you find Ottawa's history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook, and enjoy today's segment.
Good morning. My name is Michael McBane. I'm the author of John Egan, Pine and Politics in the Ottawa Valley. John Egan was an Irishman who came here in around 1830 with little money, little education. Eventually, within not too many years, he became probably the most successful lumber merchant in the entire Ottawa Valley. He was also a very prominent member of Parliament, first elected in 1848, and stayed in Parliament until his premature death in 1857 of cholera in Quebec City. So there's basically two dimensions to his life, the business side and the political side. As I mentioned, he came here with very little. He was born in Lissavahan, County Galway, which is on the west side of Ireland, a very poor part of Ireland, the west side. And that's really the context we need to look into a little bit, and to understand John Egan is to understand where he came from and the social context, the political context. When he was growing up, the big issues of the day was Catholic emancipation. And Daniel O'Connell succeeded in getting Catholic emancipation, which meant Catholics had the right to vote in Ireland. That precipitated a backlash, and it was the rise of the Orange Order as a result of granting Catholics rights. The Orangemen were afraid that Catholics would become too prominent in Ireland, and a large number of them emigrated to Canada. A big influx of Orange Order members moving to Canada following Catholic emancipation in Ireland. So Egan, he knew what discrimination was, and he knew what sectarianism was, and that would mark his career when he came to Canada afterwards. So as I mentioned, he came in the early 1830s, got off the boat in Quebec City, immediately started to inquire how to get work, was referred to the Upper Ottawa lumber industry, naturally, and was employed by James Durrell in Clarendon Township. And it was under Durrell that Egan basically learned the trade really well from the ground up, starting in the lumber shanties throughout the winter, worked as a depot clerk. So he learned all the dimensions of the lumber industry from top to bottom. And within a few years, he opened a store in Aylmer, Quebec, a supply store. And so about 1836. By 1842, he had built this beautiful mansion in Aylmer, which still stands. 161 Rue Principale in Aylmer is John Egan's house. It's now a Montessori school. Beautiful building. So it didn't take him long to become a very successful business person. I think the key to his success was he linked up with a financial person in Quebec City, Messorier, who was a very wealthy financier. So he recognized talent in Egan, so he became his financial backer, and that's why the Egan Company took off. So John Egan and Company became the prominent lumber industry in the Ottawa Valley in the 1840s until his death in 1857. He had, by the peak of his business life, employed more than 3,500 people in over 100 lumber camps, and he owned 10,000 square miles of timber limit. So he was definitely a lumber king. Now, it was through his work learning the lumber trade in the Ottawa Valley that he became very well known. Everybody knew John Egan, and he was very well liked. He treated his workers really well. And after he would cut the timber off the land in the townships, particularly starting in Pontiac County, he would sell the land for 50 cents an acre to his workers and was very generous in the payback time. And he also facilitated emigration to Canada. So he was very conscious in wanting to encourage settlement and economic development in what was fairly recently opened up territory on the Quebec side west of Montreal. And so because he was well known and popular, that was a kind of a segue into becoming a politician. He became a very popular politician because everybody knew him and everybody liked him. And so he was basically elected by acclamation his entire political career. Now, I want to move on to the substance of his politics because I think it's really an important part of his story. After the rebellions of 1837, the first election was 1841 with the United Provinces of Upper and Lower Canada. Now, the 1841 election was very, very tumultuous, a lot of violence. And the violence was basically organized by the Orange Order to try to suppress the French-Canadian vote and to suppress Catholic votes. And Egan saw this operative on the ground in the riding he was in at the time, which included the town of Aylmer. And he reacted very badly to this violence and intimidation. And while he started out as a conservative, because his political mentors and his business mentors were all conservatives, the behavior of the conservatives in the 1841 election turned him off really badly. And he became an independent reformer. And in 1841, during that campaign, he wrote a letter to the Bytown Packet. And he basically said, this is why the Irish left Ireland, was to leave this sectarian politics and to come to a land that encouraged inclusion and not sectarianism. And so he encouraged people to leave that behind when they came to Canada. Now, it strikes me that that's a very modern message. We're still faced with that challenge of people coming to Canada, and we encourage them to leave their divisive politics of the countries they've come from. Leave that behind, start anew in a liberal democracy that respects diversity. So he was first elected mayor of Aylmer, but then ran as a member of parliament for, which was then Ottawa County, later became Pontiac County, and became basically a regional minister. He was the minister looking out for economic development in West Quebec. It reminds me of Alan McEachran in Cape Breton. The regional minister would have a big influence on economic development. One of the big projects he spearheaded was to build what was called the Georgian Bay Ship Canal around Shaw Falls, which was going to be an alternative route to the Great Lakes, 500 miles shorter than going down the St. Lawrence. The minute he died, 1857, this project stopped and was never restarted. So it kind of shows you the political impact he had. He could get funding, but after he died, other regional interests took over. His politics included, as I mentioned, a concern for inclusion and building liberal democracy. That's what made him a reformer. So he was battling for a responsible government, and it wasn't long before he was starting to make headway there. And he also advocated that Bytown become the permanent capital of the new government. When he first went to Parliament, so this is early 1849, Parliament was sitting in Montreal at that time. And just to give you an indication of the violence and the turmoil of the politics, Parliament buildings were burned down by the Orangemen in Montreal, 1849. It's ironic because this is seen as an organization that's loyal, but they burnt down Her Majesty's Parliament and they attacked the Governor General with stones, etc., threatened his life. Egan's caught in the middle of this, and he actually had to be rescued and taken out of the core of the old Montreal during the violence. So, you know, that kind of just buttressed his commitment to non-sectarian politics. But it reminds Canadians of how tumultuous the beginnings of our democracy were. So, in pursuing his politics, he was a great friend of French Canadians. He was one of the few lumber kings who had a close business partnership with Joseph Aumont, French Canadian in Bytown. He befriended French Canadian politicians, including Louis-Joseph Papineau, whom a lot of Orangemen castigated and vilified. He was a friend of Papineau, friend of French Canadians, friend of Bishop Gig. I should also mention that when Egan entered business, he switched religion from Catholic to Anglican. It made his business career more successful. But to Egan's credit, he always maintained a link with the Catholic community. So he became a mediator between Catholics and Protestants. And that was another way that he built bridges and solidified this coming together of different cultures, different religions. And that was the key to the success of Confederation. Now, unfortunately, he died in 1857, so he's kind of forgotten in history. I was determined to bring his story forward, so I wrote a book on John Egan. I was surprised that no historians really did him his due, and I think it's partly because of his premature death. Had he lived, he would have, I'm convinced, have been recognized as the father of Confederation, because he was very much in line with D'Arcy McGee in terms of consciously and deliberately working with alliances with French Canadian Catholics, with Orange Protestants, and his colleagues in Parliament, while he did live in the 1840s and 50s, included all the fathers of Confederation in terms of LaFontaine and Baldwin and Brown and John A. Macdonald, etc. So they all knew him, they all respected him, and worked closely with him. So that's why I think he deserves more credit as basically helping to lay the groundwork for Confederation. So just a minute on some of his business accomplishments. He, because he was big in the lumber industry, that kind of had spin-off effects that made him a big player in transportation. He ran steamboats on the Ottawa River. He set up a horse railway around Shaw Falls. He later became a pioneer in helping to co-finance the building of the railway, the Bytown Prescott Railway in early 1850s. As I mentioned, he had been involved in building canals. He built and was responsible for setting up the company that built the Aylmer Road. So very much a builder of the country, very much conscious of the need to lay the economic infrastructure and framework for the development of the country. So I think Egan, as a business person, but also as a politician, is a prominent Canadian who should be recognized, a generous Irishman who had passion and compassion for this country. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see the fruits of his efforts. He also was friends with a lot of heroic people, or I could say legendary figures like Joseph Montferrand. Montferrand, some people think, well, he's just a folklore legend. He was a real person. And when John Egan was Member of Parliament, he would chair parliamentary hearings into the lumber industry. And one of the committee hearings had to do with looking into the negative impacts of a bridge near the island of Montreal that impacted on the flow of lumber and timber rafts down the river. Interestingly enough, some of the witnesses he called, it includes Joseph Montferrand, who came because he was an expert river pilot at the time. And so it solidifies the fact, one of the few historical references outside of legend and folklore to Joseph Montferrand. And in the same hearings, he invited Peter Egan down. Obviously not at the same day because Montferrand and Egan were legendary enemies. But at that time, by that time, Peter Egan had become a respectable business person as well. So it was a very colorful life at the center of a lot of Canadian history. And while a politician and having built this beautiful residence in Aylmer, he hosted a lot of people. He hosted the Governor General a couple of times. And when the Governor General would come to Egan's house in Aylmer, he opened the doors to his constituents. That's the kind of politician he was. He never forgot the humble roots of his Irish origins in the West Coast, as coming from a small village in a Gaelic-speaking part, and always had a sense of conscience and reached out to help people get a leg up. And as I mentioned, a friend of the French Canadians, when he died, the Jean-Baptiste Society of Ottawa passed a number of resolutions in recognition of his importance and his friendship with the French Canadian community. He also reached out and helped the Anishinaabe of Kitigan-Zibi establish their reserve at a time when other lumber kings were fighting the government, didn't want the land given to the Anishinaabe. So Egan was also a friend of the First Nations at a time when very few people showed any compassion to their needs and to their desperate plight and terrible living conditions. So Egan was also a great humanitarian, and that explains why he was so well liked and so thoroughly mourned when he died prematurely. He left a large family, 5 daughters, 3 sons, but his family kind of disappeared in a way. None of his sons had children, and so his descendants are from his daughters. And fortunately, there are some descendants still living in Ottawa and who have great memories and great memorabilia from Egan and from his house in those days. So I'm glad I wrote a book on John Egan. It was a challenge because of his premature death. He left no papers. There's no Egan files in the National Archives like there are for most prominent politicians. So I had to research newspapers and try to find any business records from the government. So because he was a member of Parliament, there was some records of his speeches in Parliament. Unfortunately, I found also some correspondence from Egan during his lumber baron days with the Ruggles Wright, who was one of his mentors and got him started in the lumber industry. So a lot of letters to Ruggles Wright, so that helped flesh in some of his views. And I was fortunate to find some letters that Egan had written, which kind of gave us a taste for his political philosophy. And so that it came together and told a story, and hopefully we'll get Egan's profile better known. And as we're talking here in Beechwood Cemetery, it's good to note too that Egan's remains have been moved here after he was first buried outside his residence in Aylmer. And so the Egan grave is now in Beechwood, and along with lots of other prominent Canadians of Irish background.